This is Shalom World Podcast.
Welcome to Voyage. I am your host, Frances Hogan. Welcome to our sharing on the book of Genesis. We're now in chapter 30 and picking up on the battle I told you about that was going to happen between the two wives of Jacob, who are two sisters. So I'll read the first couple of lines for you just to get you into it. Now, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister. Now, envy is not a good thing, and said to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said to her, "Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" Now, it's perfectly clear from the discussion that the people at the time didn't understand the mechanics of reproduction. And so Rachel is reacting to her husband as if he's responsible for the fact that she is not having children. But Leah is having children, so it's definitely not his problem. And that's why it's so clear that it's actually her problem, but she doesn't understand it at the time. So when Rachel realized that she was not able to have children, I don't want to call her barren because God intervenes eventually and she is allowed to have two children. What she did was she did exactly what Sarah did to Abraham back in the early part of Genesis, and she offered her maid to Jacob as to act as a surrogate mother, is what we would say nowadays, for her. And the children that would be born to this woman would be Rachel's children. That's why I call the person a surrogate mother. Most of the commentators would use different language. They would say that this woman was a concubine, which is fine. I don't object to that. But I think that since the children of this woman are going to be Rachel's children, to call her a surrogate mother, I think is correct as well. Rachel's reaction to the two children that are born to the woman who's called Bilhah, there are Dan and Naphtali. She describes it in terms of the struggle she's having with her sister. Now, both women had certain disadvantages. Leah was plain and she had the eye problem, and Rachel was pretty. But Leah was fertile and Rachel wasn't fertile at this particular time. And even though Jacob did not work one single day to get Leah, she turned out to be the most fertile and the most faithful of wives that any man could ever want. And she gave him 6 sons and a daughter, as I said already. But at a certain point when she temporarily was not bearing children, in other words, her womb was taking a bit of time out, she imitated Rachel and then gave her maid to Jacob to act as a surrogate mother for her. So Jacob ended up with 4 wives, or 1 legal wife, 1 lover, and 2 concubines. Whichever way you want to compute it, there are actually 4 women involved. And the 4 women, the 2 maids did not actually really participate in the battle. The battle was really between the 2 sisters, Rachel and Leah. There was massive hostility between the 2 women. They ended up not agreeing on anything except leaving Laban's house in order to go back to Jacob's place. Now, let me just give you a tiny little bit on this. God's wisdom in Genesis 2:24 laid down that a man should have 1 wife. Now, if Jacob had been allowed to marry Rachel, they would most likely have had a normal marriage without all the battle and all the hassle. And so Laban was responsible for this terrible chaos that was there. And nobody was a winner in this war. Everybody suffered. Jacob had to put up with this war. He would have had a peaceful relationship with Rachel, as I said, and he would have been in the same position as Abraham, having a barren wife for a time. Leah had a terrible life. She was the most faithful wife to Jacob, but she was never loved. And no matter how many children she gave him, he couldn't come round to give the love that she actually needed or wanted, okay? Rachel had a terrible life as well, because the man she loved was being shared with 3 other women, and true love wants the beloved for themselves. The 2 maids involved had no freedom at all. they had no freedom as to whether they would marry or not marry, or to whom they would be given. So they were really in the position of slaves. If they had refused, they would have been thrown out, and they would have been just used by anybody in society as useless creatures. And we will discover later that the children of these two slave girls, is what I prefer to call them, their children, there was 4 boys involved, and they were considered of low status in the family. And we're going to discover the problem when we get into the story of Joseph, that this low status of these 4 men, that they were really the workforce in the family, is going to create terrible, terrible problems for everybody. And it's going to cost Joseph his life as well, almost. And it will put him into exile for the rest of his life. So what happened was that the mothers, each mother named her child, and without being aware of it, she was saying something prophetic, which actually had significance in later history, which is really fascinating. But that doesn't mean that the women were aware of saying anything prophetic. Not at all. They were responding to the situation that they actually found themselves in. And you'll find that, especially with there's 12 sons altogether, especially with the early ones, they seem to reflect into the early history of Jacob's descendants. Let's look at the first one. The first child to be born was called Reuben, and it means see, a son. Now this means Leah said to Jacob, see, I have borne you a firstborn son. That was the greatest privilege a woman could have in those days, that she not only gave a son, but she gave a firstborn son who was going to be the heir and would have the double portion and would have the blessing and everything else. But this is the most complicated family you've ever come across. And so I will point out to you later, Reuben will not get the blessing of the firstborn. He will not get the double portion. He will not be the chosen one. That's just to keep you interested for later. Even to this day, if you speak to a devout Jewish person and ask them who they are, their answer will be, as I have heard it myself, we are the children of Israel. Now, the presumption of many people today in hearing that language, we are the children of Israel, means that we belong to the state of Israel. That is not the answer. When they say we are the children of Israel, they're all saying we are the descendants of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. And so this is the identity of the chosen people. And when they say we're the children of Israel, they're not saying we're not grown up. They're giving you a very specific identity, which is very important. So let's look at the significance of some of the things that are being said. The first son was Reuben, and what Leah said was that the Lord has heard my affliction. That's in chapter 29, verse 32. When you come to the Exodus story, in the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verse 7, what do you hear? That the Lord has heard the affliction of his firstborn children in Egypt. In the second son that is born, that is Simeon, she says, and it's the same Leah. Leah gives the first 4 children. The Lord has heard that I was hated. He's heard my cry. And this is what you find also in Exodus 3:7, that the Lord says, I have heard their cry in their affliction. I have seen that they are hated. So it seems that the names they're actually choosing are actually pointing to something in the future. I just want to show you this prophetic level that's not obvious to most people. The words that God gave to Moses at the burning bush was that, yes, he had heard the cry of his people. He realized that they were rejected and that they were hated and that he was going to bring them deliverance. So the third son that was born to Leah was Levi, This is chapter 29, verse 34. Now, in the future, Levi was going to be extremely important because it was the tribe of Levi that was going to produce Moses, the great deliverer. It was going to produce Aaron, the first high priest, and Miriam, the first prophetess. And so it was Moses, the liberator, that was going to join Israel to God in covenant. And what Leah asked in calling the child Levi, I hope this has joined me to my husband. In other words, that he would truly accept me. But it was through the covenant that Moses was going to make with God on behalf of the people that they would truly have God as their husband. And so the struggle of Israel was always to have God as their husband. And their whole history was about that. Now, the fourth son that Leah gave to Jacob, long before Rachel could give him anything, was called Judah. And Judah was one of the most significant of the sons as well. And Judah, of course, means praise. And that name has come right up into modern times. The people of Judah are simply called Jews today. And it means the people who praise God. And so she simply praised God on the fourth child. In other words, I have done everything a wife is expected to do for her husband. I have given you 4 wonderful children. In the future, Judah was also going to be the cause of the praise of the people of God, because it was through the line of Judah that the Messiah, the true liberator, represented by Moses, was going to join all nations and all peoples to God by his very special covenant, so that we could all call God Father, our Father who art in heaven. That every nation, every language, every people of every generation could do it. So that's the fourth one. Now, it's at this particular point that Rachel decides, I better have children, and if I can't have them myself, then I will give my maid. So she gives her maid, or her servant, I think it's her slave really, to Jacob, and Bilhah brings forth the 5th boy, who's called Dan. And the meaning of the name is that God has judged me. That means that I have been exonerated by the Lord. Okay, so that's in chapter 30 and verse 6. So God has judged my case. In other words, he has listened to me, he has heard my case, and he has also heard my voice, and he's given me a son. And Bilhah gave the 6th child to Jacob as well, and his name was Naphtali. That's in chapter 30 and verse 8. And Naphtali means wrestling. And Rachel said, with great wrestling have I wrestled with my sister, but I have prevailed. She's only got 2 children, and Leah has 4. And she still thinks she has prevailed, but she has no idea at all that this battle is going to go on and on and on. She just doesn't realize it. So this judgment and prevailing and everything seems to refer to the struggles that the people had in the wilderness and their rebellion against God, and God had to make a judgment on their behalf. And also, that they would wrestle with their enemies in order to be able to survive. They had to wrestle with Amalek, for example, in the desert. When that happened, then Leah actually presented her maid to Jacob. Now, the interesting thing for me as a woman is we're not told what Jacob thought of any of this. I would have thought, surely he would have a response. Surely he would say, I want or I don't want. But he seemed to let the women run the show. And he seemed to think that this was the way to keep whatever level of peace he could have in the place. So Zilpah, Leah's slave, gave 2 sons, Gad and Asher. Gad means a troop comes, and Asher means happy. So that seems to refer down to later things in the history of Israel as well. Then Leah herself gave 2 more sons to Jacob. Now, notice we're not told about daughters at all. There's only 1 daughter actually admitted in this whole thing, and the likelihood of all the children being sons is most likely nil. The reason why all the emphasis is on the sons is that these 12 that are named are going to be the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel, the children of Israel. And it's from them that the whole race of the chosen people actually come. And so Leah said, Issachar means God has given me hire. That is in chapter 30, verse 18. And in Zebulun, God has given me a good dowry. That's very interesting. It's also very sad. She's given 6 children personally to Jacob. And she said, nobody gave me a dowry. My husband didn't even work a day for me, but God gave me a good dowry. He gave me children. He gave me a multiplicity of children. And I find it very sad to look at that and to look at many women today who will cultivate barrenness and won't have children and don't consider children riches and don't consider that this is a great treasure and that you are the one who's actually giving a future to the human race. It's sad. But these women appreciated children, realized that children were the future, and to have my children running the future is a very big thing. So she understood that she was giving a great gift, not only to her husband, Jacob, but also to God in the chosen people. Then, at the very end of this struggle, now this struggle is going on for years, it's just I'm giving it to you quickly. At the very end of this, God opens Rachel's womb. Now, there's a whole history in the Bible of significant women who were not able to give birth and that God intervened. And the emphasis is on that God alone can provide us with the people that are going to be significant in the line leading to the Messiah or anything that God wants to do. He alone can choose these people. And so the emphasis on the very specific intervention of God. And that's quite important. Okay. So the last 2 sons that make up 11 and 12, Joseph is now born to Jacob, the firstborn of his beloved wife. And Jacob makes a lot of mistakes psychologically. He doesn't hide the fact that he considers Joseph the firstborn. Oh dear, isn't that going to create trouble? Just wait till we get the story of Joseph and you'll realize that all the others are willing to kill him. He's the 11th in line, not the first. But as far as Jacob is concerned, he's the firstborn of the woman I wanted to marry. And she called him Joseph, which means that God will add more children to me now that I've begun. And that's in chapter 30 and verse 24. And just to sort of complete this picture of the battle of the women, finally, when they have already returned to the promised land, the only one of the 12 that was actually born in the promised land was Benjamin. Benjamin is the young one, the little one. But it was on the birth of Benjamin that Rachel died. It cost her her life. And so she called him the son of my sorrow. And it was Jacob who changed that to the son of my right hand. He wouldn't leave, he would consider it a negative thing that the child would be called son of my sorrow. Okay. So this brings the family of Jacob to completion. So there are 2 sons for Rachel and there are 6 for Leah and 2 each for the 2 maids. And we're going to see as the history goes on that we need to know who's who and why things turn out the way they do in the end. It'll all make sense That's why I wanted to do it for you. It is perfectly plain that out of all these children, Jacob considers the last two the chosen ones. And actually, when you look at the history that follows this, you'll discover that you'll get to the 10th century before Christ. And out of all the people that were born as children of Israel, David and Solomon turn out to be the two who are chosen. And then after that, it seems to disintegrate again. It's absolutely amazing. When you put the sons together in groups, it also begins to make more sense as well. Because Leah's 4 plus the utterances of the mother all seem to point to the Exodus. Bilhah's 2 sons seem to point to the experience in the wilderness. And Zilpah's sons and Leah's next 2 sons all seem to point to the experience of conquering the land of Canaan. And then Rachel's 2 children point to much later, as I mentioned just there now, to David and Solomon. There's a lot in there. I just wanted to sort of hint at it for you. Okay. So, as I've said to you before, it's not likely that the mothers realized they were saying anything prophetic, but that God was using this situation because he knew that the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel were being formed in this particular way. Why he allowed it to happen in this particular manner, only he knows. And his divine providence allowed it to happen. And even though later legislation wouldn't allow 2 sisters to be married by the one man, and later legislation didn't allow them to have polygamy either, this is the way it was at the time of Jacob. And so God worked with the material he had. So think of Jeremiah 18 and the potter working with the clay. The clay is actually quite difficult to work with. And it needs a very skilled potter to actually do something wonderful with the clay. And that's what God is doing all the time. So it shows that God is willing to work with us in the circumstances we actually find ourselves in. Now Jacob has a large family and he has a major problem. He needs money. He needs possessions. He needs his own place. He actually needs to go home. And this is the way God works with us as well. God puts the idea into your head. You think you do it yourself, of course. You get this bright idea thinking, oh, I thought of that, not realizing that God may have put it into your head. So Jacob gets the idea, but what was it that made Jacob think in terms of, I want to go home? It was when Rachel gave him her firstborn son. And it seems that Jacob knew from the very beginning that this child was going to be different to all the others. And he was. He actually stood out in the whole family as completely different. He was a prince among men. He was a completely different caliber of person altogether. And his brother Benjamin was different to the others as well. And by different, I don't mean physically. I mean that the character, the personality, the call, there seems to have been a call on particularly Joseph's life from the very beginning. And it seems that Jacob recognized it instantly. So it was like as if Jacob looked at this child and realized, there is the next patriarch. And from the story that I will tell you between now and the end of Jacob's life, you will understand why Jacob would get that impression instantly. I won't tell you now because it's too soon. So it's after the birth of Joseph that Jacob decided it was time to go home. He had his beloved son. Now, if he could hide some of his feelings, it might have helped that there wouldn't be hatred among some of the other sons. Jacob began to look around and realize, I don't belong in this land called Syria. I have no destiny here. I have no inheritance here. If I go along with Laban the way he wants, I will remain penniless and I will remain a hired servant here. It's time for me to think of how to go home. So he made a second agreement with Laban. Now, the first one made him a hired servant. This time he's not going to be a hired servant. He's going to be an equal, and he is going to make the arrangements, and he is going to be in charge. This time, Jacob is taking authority. So you can see the maturing process that's been going on. So it was time for him to go back to the country where he would be the third patriarch, and that he could take the blessing of Abraham and pass it on to his children, but it had to be passed on in the country that God wanted it, and that was not Syria. But the problem was Laban didn't want him to go home, because Jacob turned out to be a very generous workman. He was very generous with his time, with his service, and you'll see as the story develops that he was also more than honest with Laban, but Laban was not honest with him. And so the uprightness of the man is beginning to come forward, which is good, because you can start out with a negative feeling about Jacob. But Laban made a confession to Jacob, which is actually very important. He said, and this is between verses 25 and 43, he said, "The Lord has blessed me because of you." Now, this is a very important thing. Laban realizes that God hadn't blessed him for his own sake. It was through this person who was chosen to be part of God's plan for setting up the kingdom of God on earth that he has been blessed. And of course, if you bring that into Jesus' covenant, the whole world is blessed because of Jesus, not because of us. It's because of him. It's because of what he has done for us. So God the Father blesses us for the sake of his beloved Son. I just want you to hear the expression beloved Son. You read in Ephesians 4:32, God forgives us in Christ or for his sake. 1 John 2:12, your sins have been forgiven on account of his Son, that is, because of Jesus. We have been blessed because of Jesus. We will see this later in the story of Joseph, because God will bless the house of Potiphar for the sake of Joseph, because the beloved one is present, and the beloved one is remaining faithful to God and in union with God. So God will bless the whole household because of Joseph. Okay. Another example I'll give you for that is 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1, where when David became king, he asked his servants, was there anyone left in Saul's house that he could bless because of Jonathan? Because David and Jonathan had been very, very close. From verses 28 to 34, it is Jacob who negotiated a deal with Laban. Laban wants Jacob to stay. And Jacob says, I will do it under the following conditions. We have got to start being equals. It was high time. So he decided that it was time for him to build up flocks of sheep and goats and herds for himself, because otherwise he cannot go back to the land of Canaan as poverty-stricken as he left it. He actually ended up staying another 6 years with Laban, because it was going to take that amount of time to actually get himself to the point of being wealthy enough to be able to be set up as a patriarch. So why would this problem be there for Jacob? It's because Isaac lasted 40 years after the incident that we dealt with about the blessing and that made Esau hate Jacob. And this is only 20 years. So he's not going to inherit from Isaac for another 20. He has to build up his own wealth. It's very important. And so the Psalm 126 verse 6 says, we go out sowing in tears, we come back reaping with joy. So Jacob went out into Syria absolutely poverty-stricken and a fugitive, and he comes back a wealthy man, a prince in his own right. Nobody has to give him the title. And you'll find that when he gets back to the promised land, that people will treat him as such, as a chieftain, a prince, or the language among the pagans would have been a king, but that language was not used among the chosen people for a very long time until King Saul came into the picture. Jacob is going to go he has gone from a position of plenty as a youngster to poverty. And now he goes from poverty to plenty. That gives him a lot of experience of learning wisdom and learning understanding so that he can go forward and be very successful in his work. In negotiating with Laban, you can read this for yourself. The story is too long, it would take too much time. In negotiating with Laban, Jacob doesn't leave himself at the mercy of a deceiving and greedy uncle. No way. He's very clever, and he uses his intelligence to outwit Laban this time. And the scheme seems awfully simple. He says, all the spotted and speckled among the sheep and goats will be mine. All the others will be yours. And it looks an absolutely watertight thing that this could happen. And it also looks pretty watertight that there wouldn't be that number of spotted and speckled. And so Laban agreed, because Laban's decided, yeah, I'll have the biggest flock, I'll be okay, he won't have much. But Laban was completely wrong. It looked as if the whole thing was foolproof. And because of that, Laban agreed rather quickly, deciding that he would be the wealthier of the two. But it didn't work out that, because Jacob admitted later to his wives that he had received information in a dream of how to work the thing out in the reproduction of the animals, that he would have the healthy animals and that he would have the majority of them speckled and spotted. Now, the way it's described in the book of Genesis, I don't think us moderns would actually understand. All we have to understand is that Jacob is saying that he got help because dreaming the answer, they would consider the dream came from God. And this kind of scheming and plotting suits Jacob very well. That's the kind of character he is. In the years of his bondage, we actually can see and observe for ourselves that Jacob increased and multiplied until he had a very large household. So first of all, he has a very large family. And then we see that he is helped somehow, whether that dream came specifically from God or not, we couldn't prove, that he was helped in order to increase and multiply his possessions. And we're going to see why heaven might have helped him in going in that direction in a little while. In the days of his bondage, when he was only a hired servant, Jacob worked very diligently. He was a hard-working man. He was very generous with his time. He was very honest. And we're going to see evidence of that later as well. Now that he is working for himself, he has more energy because he has this family to take care of and to provide for. And so what we're told in verse 43, that Jacob became exceedingly prosperous, and he had large flocks, female and male servants, camels and donkeys. Now, a camel is very important. The donkey isn't as significant as the camel, because to travel by camel in those days was first-class travel. And so that he owned camels in the plural means you're actually dealing with a wealthy man. He could go and buy camels, okay, and therefore he can travel that way. This means that he can travel home in the style that Abraham's servant travelled out to Haran and home using the camels. So he will go back home as a very wealthy man. He left as a fugitive. He goes back as the successor of Abraham. He goes back as the patriarch, of the chosen people, and he comes with his own children. So now I want to bring you into chapter 31, because in chapter 31, we have Jacob separating himself from Laban. Now, Jacob knows that Laban would never, ever let him go. He's far too useful. And he's the best workman that Laban actually has. And we discover at this particular point that Laban now has sons as well, but it appears that the sons are not nearly as useful to him as Jacob is. There's no way that Laban would actually agree. So let's begin chapter 31, and it's Jacob fleeing from Laban. Now I want you to hear the words. He has to leave as a fugitive. He left home as a fugitive, but he was poverty-stricken. He now leaves Laban as a fugitive, but he's a wealthy man. So now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was ours he has acquired all his wealth. That is both true and false at the same time, because it was through his own industriousness that all of this happened. They wouldn't have had the knowledge that Jacob had about the reproduction part of it. That was what he got in the dream, was how to enable the animals to reproduce in a particular way. So what happens now is envy on the part of Laban's sons. And in the deal that Jacob made with Laban for the 6 years, it was so foolproof and watertight that Jacob said to Laban, I will look after yours and your sons can look after mine. So it was all above board. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was done behind Laban's back at all. And Jacob saw that the countenance of Laban indeed was not favourable towards him as before. Why is that? Because as far as Laban was concerned, everything should come to himself. He didn't want Jacob to have anything, even though Jacob had this large family and Laban didn't. And so it's at this particular point when Jacob realizes that he's no longer welcome in this place. It's only then that it really comes to him, it's time to go. And when he's sure it's time to go, that is the point at which God speaks to him and tells him to go. This is actually quite important. Now, I want you to see there are two things that Jacob finds very difficult to let go. And I'm saying it not as a commentary on him, but on us. Fear is a real problem for him, and deceit as well. It sort of suits his character to slip away and not even allow Laban to say goodbye to his children and grandchildren. This is a problem he has to overcome, and he will in the end. But it's a problem that many, many, many people have as well. And if fear is dominant, faith is not. If faith is dominant, fear is dealt with. It's actually that simple. So we either decide to put our trust in God and the one for whom nothing is impossible, that we turn to him, or we allow our own feelings and our own negativities and our own fears and fears coming in from the world and all the rest to dominate us, and then we don't get anywhere. We're going to see in the journey home that Jacob has to deal with the fear and the deceit as well. And he comes out pretty good. A deep, personal relationship with God, one in which you are really communing with God, one in which you're telling him everything and you are asking him to guide you in everything, will deal with the fear. It will also deal with deceit. You have no need for it whatsoever. But we're going to find that when Jacob sets on this journey, he is leaving the compound that he has been living in for a long time. And even though it was a situation of servitude for him, there was some kind of security attached to it. When he gets out into the open country, he can be attacked. And there's two people he fears most at this particular point. One is Laban, who will take revenge, and the other is his brother Esau. If he finds out, he will take revenge as well. And so he has this huge fear that he has to face and he has to overcome. Now, why does the Lord allow him to go into this situation for that fear to come up? So that he will overcome it. You can't overcome fear theoretically. You've got to overcome it in the actual situation. And courage is facing fear and not allowing fear to dominate us. So that's a very big lesson, and we'll pick this up in the next episode because it's going to be an important lesson for you and me as well. So thank you for listening. Slán agus Banach Déilíomh. Goodbye. God bless you.
Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to hear what you thought of today's session. Share your feedback with us at podcast@shalomworld.org. You can motivate and support us today. shalomworld.org/donate. Visit shalomworld.org for more information about Shalom World podcasts. To get the latest updates, make sure you follow us on Instagram at Shalom World Podcasts. Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and others.